The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the Beverly Hills Hotel's crystal ballroom, each prism reflecting the anxious energy of 180 music industry professionals gathered on November 15, 1977. This wasn't a concert. This was a showcase, a carefully orchestrated evening where established record executives, radio programmers, and A&R representatives came to discover the next profitable act. The venue hummed with the particular frequency of money and influence. Conversations conducted in hushed tones, business cards exchanged like currency, deals negotiated over champagne flutes that cost more than most musicians earned in a month. Behind a makeshift backstage area constructed from portable dividers near the service corridor, Eddie Van Halen sat motionless on a folding chair, his homemade Frankenstrat guitar resting across his lap. His fingers traced the familiar wear patterns on the neck, the smooth valleys carved by 10,000 hours of obsessive practice. At 22 years old, Eddie looked even younger under the harsh backstage fluorescence, his hair falling in dark waves past his shoulders, his clothes simple and worn, a stark contrast to the designer suits and expensive jewelry adorning the audience just 50 feet away. Van Halen had been granted exactly 8 minutes. 8 minutes to prove themselves to an industry that had repeatedly dismissed them as another garage band from Pasadena. 8 minutes to justify the gamble that their manager had taken by calling in every favor to secure this slot. 8 minutes to transform from unknown quantities into something worthy of investment. The path to this moment had been paved with rejection. Columbia Records had listened to their demos and suggested they find a real singer instead of relying on David Lee Roth's theatrical antics. Atlantic had dismissed Eddie's guitar work as too flashy, not commercial enough. Elektra had been more direct. Guitar heroes are dead. The market wants simple, accessible music. Each rejection had driven Eddie deeper into his garage, where he modified amplifiers and built effects pedals with an obsessiveness that bordered on mania. While his peers socialized and dated, Eddie rewired circuits and experimented with voltage variations, chasing sounds that existed only in his imagination. His fingers had bled countless times from practicing techniques that didn't have names yet, creating methods of playing guitar that seemed to defy the instrument's physical limitations. Tonight, those countless hours of solitary work would either validate his vision or confirm what the industry had been telling him all along, that innovation without commercial appeal was merely self-indulgence. The evening's format was ruthlessly efficient. Each act received their allotted time slot, performed their 2 or 3 songs, and left the stage. No encores, no extended solos, no deviation from the schedule. The industry professionals had busy calendars and short attention spans. This was about identifying marketable talent quickly and moving on. Eddie could hear fragments of conversation from the main ballroom, laughter at appropriate intervals, the clink of silverware against china, the rustle of programs being consulted for the next act's information. Kloss Radio had positioned microphones throughout the venue for their live broadcast, and somewhere beyond the elegant walls, thousands of listeners were tuning in to discover which unknown acts might be worth remembering. The established performers that evening commanded respect through proven success. Fleetwood Mac's individual members had their own dressing rooms. The Eagles' equipment was handled by a team of professional roadies. These were artists whose next albums were guaranteed radio play, whose tour dates sold out based on name recognition alone. Van Halen, by contrast, had set up their own equipment in the narrow space behind the dividers. Their sound check had lasted exactly 3 minutes. Their dressing room was a corner of the corridor where they stored their instrument cases. No one asked for autographs. No industry representatives stopped by to introduce themselves or wish them luck. Eddie's brother Alex sat behind a minimal drum kit, methodically adjusting each piece for the 100th time. Michael Anthony tuned his bass with the mechanical precision of someone trying to calm his nerves through familiar routine. David Lee Roth paced the small space like a caged animal, his energy barely contained by the temporary wall surrounding them. Then they heard it, 2 voices just beyond the thin partition that separated them from the main venue. Victoria Sterling, the evening's coordinator, was briefing someone, probably a radio host, about the upcoming acts. After the intermission, we have one more new group. Van Halen, I think. Young band from Los Angeles. A pause, papers rustling. Are they any good? The second voice carried the casual indifference of someone accustomed to filtering through countless hopeful musicians. Honestly, I have no idea. My assistant booked them. Something about a guitar player who's supposed to be impressive, but you know how these local bands oversell themselves. Eddie's fingers stilled on the Frankenstrat's neck. How long are we giving them? 8 minutes. Just enough to fill the slot before we announce the award presentations. Most people will probably use it as a bathroom break. Quiet laughter. Should I build them up in the introduction? Don't oversell it. Just mention the name and let them play. These showcase events are really about the established acts anyway. The new groups are just filler. The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished cigarette. Filler. Background noise. Something to occupy time while the real entertainment prepared. Eddie heard every syllable with crystalline clarity. His bandmates had heard it too. Alex's drumstick adjustments stopped mid-motion. Michael's tuning fork went silent. David's pacing ceased entirely. For a moment, the four members of Van Halen sat in complete stillness. Not the stillness of shock or hurt, but the stillness that precedes action. The stillness of a decision being made without words. Eddie stood slowly, lifting the Frankenstrat by its neck. The guitar felt different in his hands now, heavier somehow, weighted with purpose rather than hope. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of a fire extinguisher mounted on the corridor wall. The face looking back at him had changed. The uncertainty that had shadowed his features for months was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. They think we're filler, he said quietly, not looking at his bandmates. Alex nodded once. I heard. Bathroom break music, Michael added with bitter accuracy. David Lee Roth's response was characteristically direct. So let's give them something they can't ignore. But Eddie was already there mentally. The doubt that had plagued him during their drive to Beverly Hills, the anxiety about playing for industry professionals, the fear that maybe the record executives were right about his guitar work being too complex, all of it evaporated. What remained was pure determination, crystallized into a single thought. They would remember this performance whether they wanted to or not. The transformation was internal but absolute. Eddie Van Halen, the anxious young musician hoping for approval, ceased to exist. In his place stood someone who had nothing left to lose because he'd already been dismissed. And paradoxically, that dismissal had freed him. At 9:47 p.m., a production assistant appeared at their makeshift entrance. You're up in 2 minutes. The four members of Van Halen gathered their instruments and walked toward the stage. As they moved through the narrow corridor, they passed the spot where Victoria Sterling and the radio host had held their conversation. Neither adult was there anymore, but Eddie heard their words echoing with perfect clarity. Filler, bathroom break, no idea if they're any good. The Crystal Ballroom's main lights had been dimmed for the performance segment. Stage lights illuminated a modest platform at the far end of the room, where a basic sound system waited. The 180 industry professionals looked exactly as Eddie had imagined. Well-dressed, slightly bored, checking their watches and consulting their programs to see what came next. The radio host took the microphone with practiced ease. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one final new act this evening before our award presentations. Please welcome Van Halen. The applause was perfunctory, polite, brief, and obviously dutiful. Scattered claps from people who were already mentally planning their exit strategies. Van Halen took the stage in silence. Alex settled behind his drums, Michael plugged in his bass, David adjusted his microphone stand, and Eddie, moving with deliberate calm, connected the Frankenstrat to his modified amplifier setup. The venue's acoustics were pristine, designed for intimate performances where every note would be clearly audible. There would be no hiding behind volume or distortion. Every mistake, every imperfection, every moment of hesitation would be magnified and broadcast to both the live audience and the radio listeners beyond. Eddie looked out at the sea of faces. Some were already engaged in quiet conversations. Others were checking their phones or organizing their belongings. A few seemed genuinely interested in what this unknown guitar player might produce. He recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same expression he'd seen from record executives, from club owners, from music journalists who'd attended their previous performances. Mild curiosity mixed with low expectations. The look of people who were giving you their attention temporarily, waiting for you to either justify it or confirm their assumption that you weren't worth it. Without announcing a song title or addressing the audience, Eddie began to play. The first note cut through the ballroom's refined atmosphere like a blade through silk. Not loud, the venue's acoustics didn't require excessive volume, but impossibly clear and present. It was followed by another note, then another, each one perfectly placed, building a melody that seemed to emerge from the guitar itself rather than being imposed upon it. But this wasn't a conventional song. There was no rhythm section, no vocals, just Eddie and the Frankenstrat engaged in what sounded like an intimate conversation conducted in a language that transcended words. The conversations in the audience didn't stop immediately. It took approximately 30 seconds for the first table to go quiet. Then another. The radio host, who'd been shuffling his notes for the next segment, looked up sharply. Victoria Sterling, who'd been circulating among the tables, stopped mid-stride. What they were hearing was impossible. Guitar techniques that shouldn't exist, sounds that defied explanation, a performance that seemed to push the instrument beyond its theoretical limitations. Eddie's right hand moved across the strings with surgical precision, while his left hand created notes by tapping the fretboard directly, bypassing traditional picking methods entirely. The technique had no name yet. Eddie simply called it finger tapping, but its effect on the listening audience was immediate and profound. Jaws literally dropped. Conversations ceased entirely. The industry professionals who'd attended countless showcases, who'd heard every variation of rock guitar imaginable, sat transfixed by sounds they'd never encountered. Alex, Michael, and David remained motionless, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged entirely to Eddie and his guitar. This wasn't a band performance. It was a demonstration of possibilities that most people hadn't known existed. The melody Eddie played was deceptively simple at its core, but the execution was breathtaking. His fingers moved so quickly across the fretboard that they seemed to blur, yet every note was distinct and purposeful. Harmonics rang out like crystal bells. Sustained notes seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. 60 seconds into the performance, the transformation of the audience was complete. 180 industry professionals sat in absolute silence, their attention focused entirely on the young man with the homemade guitar, who was casually rewriting the rules of what a six-string instrument could accomplish. The radio broadcast captured every note in pristine clarity. Across Los Angeles, listeners were calling KLOS to ask who this guitarist was, where they could hear more, when this unknown band might be performing again. The switchboard lit up with inquiries from people who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Eddie built the performance methodically, adding layers of complexity without sacrificing melody. What had started as a simple guitar piece evolved into something that sounded like an entire orchestra compressed into 6 strings. He used techniques that wouldn't have names for years. Dive bombs with the tremolo bar that created sounds like jet engines. Harmonic squeals that seemed to defy acoustical laws. Rhythmic patterns that suggested multiple guitarists playing simultaneously. But perhaps most remarkably, Eddie never lost sight of the song itself. Beneath all the technical innovation was a melody that was genuinely beautiful, emotional, and memorable. This wasn't showing off for its own sake. It was artistry enhanced by technical mastery rather than overshadowed by it. The performance lasted exactly 2 minutes and 36 seconds. When Eddie played the final note, a sustained harmonic that seemed to ring forever before finally fading into silence, the Crystal Ballroom remained quiet for several heartbeats. Then the applause began. Not polite showcase applause, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. People stood. Industry veterans who'd seen everything worth seeing in rock music found themselves cheering for an unknown guitarist who'd just proven that there were still undiscovered countries in the musical landscape. Victoria Sterling stood near the back of the room with her mouth slightly open, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. The radio host had abandoned his prepared script and was speaking directly into his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I honestly don't know what we just heard, but I don't think any of us will forget it. The A&R representatives who'd come expecting to identify commercially viable talent suddenly realized they'd witnessed something rarer. Genuine innovation. Business cards were already being prepared. Mental notes were being taken about scheduling immediate meetings. Eddie stood on the small stage, the Frankenstrat hanging from his shoulders, looking out at an audience that had been completely transformed. These were the same people who dismissed Van Halen as filler music just minutes earlier. Now they were on their feet, demanding more. But Eddie was done. Without saying a word to the audience, without acknowledging the applause, he simply unplugged his guitar and walked off the stage. His bandmates followed, equally silent. They'd proven their point. Nothing more needed to be said. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Before Van Halen had even reached their makeshift backstage area, representatives from 3 major record labels were asking Victoria Sterling for the band's contact information. The KLOS radio host was already planning to replay the performance during his next broadcast. Music journalists who'd attended the showcase were calling their editors to describe what they'd witnessed. But in the narrow corridor behind the stage dividers, the 4 members of Van Halen sat quietly, processing what had just occurred. They'd entered the evening as hopeful unknowns seeking industry approval. They were leaving as the most talked-about act in Los Angeles. Eddie looked down at the Frankenstrat resting across his lap. The same guitar that record executives had dismissed as the tool of an uncommercial artist had just silenced a room full of industry professionals. The techniques he'd developed in solitary practice sessions had proven their worth on the most demanding stage possible. "Think they remember us now?" Alex asked quietly. Eddie's response was barely audible, but it carried absolute certainty. "They'll never forget." Within a week, Van Halen had signed their first major recording contract. Within a month, they were in the studio recording what would become their debut album. Within a year, they were headlining arenas across America. And it all traced back to November 15th, 1977, to 8 minutes at the Beverly Hills Hotel. To the moment when being dismissed as filler became the catalyst that transformed Eddie Van Halen from an unknown guitarist into a revolutionary force in rock music. The performance became legendary not because it was planned, but because it was necessary. Not because Eddie wanted to show off, but because he needed to prove that innovation and artistry couldn't be dismissed by industry executives who'd stopped listening to music and started hearing only market potential. That night, Eddie Van Halen didn't just perform. He rewrote the definition of what a guitar could do, what rock music could be, and what 8 minutes could accomplish when talent met determination. The Crystal Ballroom returned to its elegant routine. But the echoes of those 2 minutes and 36 seconds would resonate through the music industry for decades to come.